friends, Alex Valencia here with We Do Web Content. Thanks again for checking out the latest episode of SEO Happy Hour. On this episode, I have the honor to speak with Doug Zanes about the ongoing legal cases against the opioid manufacturers. Doug is the owner of Zanes Law, also a personal friend and a client. He owns the Arizona-based injury law firm that serves clients in Arizona and nationwide called Zanes Law. Make sure you check him out. A quick note before we get started, Doug and I recorded this podcast prior to the Johnson & Johnson recent $20 million settlement with the two Ohio county. So we will not be discussing that specific development, but we will be discussing the $572 million judgment against Johnson & Johnson, Purdue Pharma filing for bankruptcy as part of the settlement, and what that means in the context of the opioid crisis in our country and the legal cases against the pharmaceutical companies. Doug has a lot of insight on the subject to share with you on these developments, also with those affected by the opioid crisis and with attorneys that are trying these cases. Thank you so much for listening and enjoy. Welcome, folks. Thank you so much for joining us on another episode on SEO Happy Hour. Today's episode is not on SEO, but rather on what our clients work on. Today, we're speaking to Doug Zanes, who's a personal friend and a client of We Do Web Content. Doug Zanes is the owner of Zanes Law. Zanes Law is an Arizona personal injury law firm that not only operates and handles cases in Arizona, but throughout the United States, and also handles the type of cases we're going to be talking about today, which is mass torts. And Doug can talk a little bit about what a mass tort is, but more specifically today, we're going to be talking about the ruling that happened back in August that Oklahoma ruled that Johnson & Johnson had to pay the state $572 million for playing down the dangers and overselling the benefits of opioids. So this was the first trial of the drug manufacturer for the opioid crisis, which is, deep my heart. I've had friends who OD'd on Oxycontin and opioids, and more importantly, my dad was hooked on it for a while before he passed away till I was able to bring him home and rehab him. So it's horrible how this was being used and pushed in through big pharma and through the medical industry, but hopefully we can put a stop and use it the way it should be used. Also, there was a ruling back just this past week or 2 weeks ago. Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, they filed for bankruptcy as part of a larger plan to set aside $10 billion to resolve a variety of lawsuits that blame Purdue for the opioid crisis. Purdue Pharma is owned by the Sackler family, many of whom have also been named in lawsuits facing the company. Doug Zanes, thank you so much for being part of the show, and client and a friend. Let's start real quick. We'll basic. Tell me about you, and then maybe we could just jump in and tell the audience what a mass tort is, and we'll talk about these cases and what your thoughts are on them.
Okay, thanks, Alex. As you said, we are based out of Arizona. I've got offices in Tucson and Phoenix. I started my practice in about 2003. I've been practicing law for a little over 20 years. And, we represent clients who have been injured, really in just about every manner. Everything from car accidents to, as you mentioned, these mass tort cases. And that's, I decided years ago that if I was going to practice law, that's personal injury and injury law was where I thought I could impact society in the most positive way, help clients in the best possible way. And so we've really spent the last, 16 years or so, here at Zanes Law doing that. And I think we do it very well. We're here today and we wanted to talk about mass torts a little bit. And I think one of the things, people kind of confuse mass torts and class action cases. Class action cases tend to be where you have a group of people that have been harmed somehow, but it tends to be a much smaller group. They tend to be kind of on a state level or, largest maybe a regional level. But let's say you were to take a group of people here in the state of Arizona who were being, taxed by, a public utility in an illegal or inappropriate way, and you'd gather up the people in Arizona and bring a claim on their behalf. Mass tort claims are much bigger. I mean, they're generally on a national scale. Mass tort claims, to a large degree, tend to revolve around defective products. A large number of them being pharmaceuticals or medical devices that don't work properly, weren't designed properly, didn't include the proper warnings, all of those things. And so, when we talk about mass torts today, what we're really talking about is we're talking about huge numbers of people who have been harmed. And this, in a mass tort case is a way, quite frankly, for the legal system to simply deal with that volume of victims that are included in a case where, for example, you have, in this case, opioid medications that are sold not only on a national level, but an international level. But when we talk about within our system here in the U.S., it's everybody across the U.S., who have been injured. And this is, the opioid kind of cases are really kind of interesting because they're at this point less consumer driven and more driven by the states. Really the attorney generals in each state have been the ones who have taken the lead on going after these pharmaceutical companies in these, that produce opioids and market opioids, versus attorneys like me and private clients having to get that ball rolling. And it's a little bit of a different dynamic than we generally see, I think, in a lot of mass tort cases.
Interesting. Good. And I'm glad you touched on that, the difference between class action and mass tort, because my family and friends really don't know what kind of work we do. So there's always a differentiation. And then when I talk, I'm saying, hey, I'm going to a mass tort conference, and try to explain what that is compared to a class action, there's always some confusion. So I'm glad you touched on that. So why do you think this ruling is significant in the legal sense and in the grand scheme of the ongoing opioid crisis in our country?
Well, specifically with the Johnson & Johnson ruling, really kind of the significance of it is still out there to, I think, be figured out, because it's such a new ruling. And you really have, at least on the legal end, I mean, certainly if you're, the attorney general in Oklahoma who brought the case, you could probably disagree. Or I'm sure you disagree, but the challenge with that ruling is, I think a lot of people believe the decision the judge made was a stretch when it came to the public nuisance statute that the claim was brought under. Specifically, and I actually wrote it down, so because it's a little complicated, but essentially,
Right.
What the state of Oklahoma said was Johnson & Johnson basically violated this public nuisance statute and created an environment where, the state was forced or has been forced to spend a huge amount of money fighting the opioid crisis, dealing with the opioid crisis. And really the statute says that, a public nuisance consists in unlawfully doing an act or omitting to perform a duty, and had they either done the act or they performed the duty, or actually because they failed to perform the duty, or they caused harm. They annoyed, they injured, they endangered the comfort and the health and safety of others. And so it's sort of from my perspective, a very generalized statute. My light just went off. There you go. It's a very generalized statute. And so they sort of had to massage the statute. They had to massage the arguments to make their case. And the judge went with them. But to kind of, I guess, make my point on how challenging it was, this was just a month or so ago. If we just go back to May of this year, a very similar case was brought in North Dakota against Purdue Pharma. And the judge dismissed it. The judge in North Dakota looked at it and said, there's no way this statute was designed to deal with this situation.
Right.
And actually just dismissed the case. Where the judge in Oklahoma listened to all the evidence, made his ruling, and found in favor of the state, and fined Johnson & Johnson, for lack of a better way to put it, sanctioned them, penalized them. to the tune of about $750 million or so. But now that's up on appeal. And the question is, what will the appellate judges do with it? And a lot of attorneys think, and I happen to be in that camp, that I don't believe it'll succeed on appeal. But I think the real impact of the decision is it starts to swing momentum. When you look at these cases, right now you've got, a much bigger action going on in federal court in Ohio, which is essentially a mass tort that primarily involves the states, but some other parties are involved, that's made a bunch of different arguments. And kind of a public nuisance argument is part of that claim, but it has a number of other arguments. And so it's really a different case, a separate case. But I think the swinging of the momentum is a big deal. It's a big deal when it comes to pharmaceutical companies and them trying to balance risk and decide what do they want to do with these claims. Do they want to try to settle them? Do they want to fight them? Johnson & Johnson is known, quite honestly, in the industry as sort of the 800-pound gorilla that does fight all this stuff. And when they fought it full out and weren't successful, I think that sends a message to a lot of the other pharmaceutical companies who aren't nearly as inclined to litigate this stuff. So certainly from a plaintiff's or a claimant's perspective, I think the ruling was a big win, even if it gets overturned on appeal. Because what happens is, it's just like any news cycle. There's been a whole lot of press around this decision since it was made over the last month. My personal belief is if 3 years from now, Johnson & Johnson wins on appeal, you'll maybe see a blurb here or there. And 3 years from now or 2 years from now, all this other litigation will have moved significantly forward. And so really this decision, what matters is the decision that was made a month ago, not what happens on appeal. It's my personal belief.
Got it. Okay. So do you think the judge's ruling, and you might have kind of answered this in Johnson & Johnson's case, have any effect on, any other cases, including the multi-district litigation in Ohio?
Yeah, well, I think it impacts the parties. You actively saw Purdue Pharma, which is really one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies involved in these opioid claims and litigation, really make what they saw as an effort to settle a lot of these claims with the states. Now, you've got to keep in mind, right? You're really kind of settling with each state individually, and it's a real complicated process to do outside of, for example, the mass tort case out of Ohio. So when Purdue Pharma was trying to do it, they were really trying to work out deals with everybody, but pull everybody in. And the problem they ran into is you had some states who said, oh, okay, that sounds like a reasonable resolution to me, that proposed what was being proposed and where they ended up. But then you also had lots of other states who said that's not nearly enough money. That's not, you guys aren't putting nearly enough on the table. And so it's tough when you have, 50 or so, attorney generals who all have to agree on what the ultimate resolution is and how the money's going to be divided up. And so really what you saw was it had been a continued conversation until this ruling in Johnson & Johnson, and then suddenly a week or so later, Purdue Pharma's filing bankruptcy.
Right.
Really what they did was they said, well, we're going to make this easier on us. The law allows us to file bankruptcy. We're going to go file bankruptcy, which means now everybody has to play in the same arena. All the different states who are going after Purdue Pharma. If you want to make a claim, you've got to deal with that specific federal bankruptcy judge. You've got to stand in front of him, tell him what your claim is, get him to, he's ultimately going to approve or not approve what the settlement is or what the resolution to all of this stuff is. And so, that was, the easiest way for them to kind of approach it, if you want to know the truth, because I think they are on the top of everybody's list to go after. Johnson & Johnson was in the mix, but I think Purdue Pharma
was
really
next on the list.
Well, and I think they make up the vast majority of things, right? They're the guys who started all this stuff back in 1997 or so. And they're, from my perspective, just in everything I've read, the worst apple in the bunch. I mean, by far, my personal opinion.
Yeah. So, that makes sense. I was going to come up with, one of my questions on why they would file bankruptcy, and your answer is just to make it easy on themselves. So do you think, that they can still be sued based on the bankruptcy? So, how would this develop? Will they still be able to file opioid related lawsuits against Purdue after
No.
bankruptcy? No.
The quick answer is no. I mean, it protects them.
Yeah. And
what happens is I can bring a claim, but my claim gets stayed, and then I have to go become part of that bankruptcy.
Right.
And stand in line with all the other creditors. And, it's, and there's, bankruptcy judges deal with everything from, just personal little individual bankruptcies to these huge corporate bankruptcies. But this is going to be a big, complex bankruptcy. And lots of, you'll have lots of people in there vying, for, or with input on what the ultimate resolution is. You'll have everybody from their normal business partners, let's say banking partners, big banks, whoever they deal with as vendors, whoever, they owe money to. Again, Purdue Pharma's purpose in their bankruptcy isn't to go out of business. I don't believe.
No, it's to get out of this.
Yeah,
so they allocated $10 billion. I think part of that went to the state and a certain amount to some of the people or whoever was injured with it. What was that amount?
No, that was pretty much all to the different states.
Oh.
The problem they were running into is they couldn't agree on a number.
Right.
Owners of Purdue Pharma, they put a lot up. You got to figure, they're billionaires.
Yeah.
But they were willing to say, look, we'll put up, I believe it was $3 billion of our money. Because keep in mind, Purdue Pharma is a corporate entity. It may be owned by a family,
right,
but it's still a corporate entity. To a certain degree, or to a large degree, assuming the owners did their business correctly, you actually should protect the owners from personal liability. Now in this process, I think you have a lot of the states saying they should be personally responsible. And I'm not sure, I haven't been able to glean exactly what the basis of those arguments are. Again, it would be sort of akin to if you took this Johnson & Johnson case, which is a publicly traded company, and said, well, we're going to hit you for $750 million, but we think the CEO should pay $100 million of that. Well, he's just an employee of the company.
Right.
You've got to have a reason to hit him. Now, when you take Purdue Pharma, for example, I think it was around 2006 or 7, there was actually a subsidiary of Purdue Pharma where a number of the executives were actually charged with crimes in relation to how they were marketing opioids. And they didn't go to jail, but what happened was when it was all said and done, they had to pay out a huge amount of money because they were found guilty of breaking the law and how they marketed opioids. And so, again, it's not Purdue Pharma, it's a subsidiary. The family members aren't sitting in that subsidiary as the CEO running the company. And so, but the idea is, well, they own it, they should know everything, they should be responsible for everything, but that's not necessarily how business structures work from a legal perspective. Now, I did see, I think it was either earlier this week or the end of last week, that maybe the Attorney General of New York is really starting to look into their personal banking. I guess the allegation is they personally transfer or wire, tens of millions of dollars or more, from U.S. accounts over to Swiss accounts. Well, the question is that I have, at this point is, well, but what money was that? If they're wiring money out of a company that's a separate entity into their personal accounts, then yeah, that becomes a big problem because you suddenly put yourself in a position where you're personally responsible for now a lot of these things potentially. If what they're doing is they're just wiring their own personal money, that they can essentially kind of trail back and show, look, this is money we earn. It's our pay. It's our stock options we sold back to the company or whatever it is. But this is our personal money that we owed, and we paid tax on it. We have every right to move it to whatever bank account we want. Then what it is it's a news cycle that looks bad for them, but when it's all said and done, just kind of fades away because they haven't done anything wrong. All that is stuff that still, I think, needs to be sorted out.
Right.
But what happens is in the bankruptcy, anybody who has a claim, anybody who says they need to pay money, anybody who, has brought these legal actions. So in particular, the states now has to come to a resolution in front of a bankruptcy judge. And so any potential settlement, a bankruptcy judge will sit there and actually decide, is that a reasonable resolution, given everything? And all the parties can think that they have one, and the bankruptcy judge may look at it and say, no, that's not good enough. I think Purdue Pharma needs to put more on the table. Or if the parties can't agree, at some point, the bankruptcy judge will decide. And it'll all be done somewhere down the road, most likely. Now, conceivably, it's possible the bankruptcy judge could say, well, in order to cover these claims and pay what I think needs to be paid, we're going to dissolve the company and pay out, and sell off the assets
Right.
and all these other things, and put you guys out of business. But the perfect example, from my perspective, would be back in 2008, 9, when the government bailed out a number of the car manufacturers.
The banks. Oh.
And, the car manufacturers, and they all filed bankruptcy. Well, they're still here. They owed a lot of people a lot of money, and in particular, you can say, but that's different. We're talking about lawsuits against them. Well, it actually isn't, because when, let's say, General Motors filed bankruptcy, everybody who had a products liability claim against General Motors for a seatbelt that had failed, for a car that was improperly manufactured, there were mass tort claims against General Motors, and they all just kind of went away. If you were the claimant, the victim, you really got the short end of that stick, I believe, in the grand scheme of things. And so, what Purdue Pharma filing bankruptcy, I don't think is a great thing for the states and the claimants, but the problem is that is where everybody knew they would go if a resolution wasn't reached. States are sophisticated. The attorney generals in each state, they're sophisticated. They're smart lawyers. You have states, they're not, individuals. Everybody knows how this stuff works. And, and everybody knew that that's where they were going to go if a resolution wasn't reached. But now we have to see how it all shakes out.
If Purdue were a publicly traded company like Johnson & Johnson, would the bankruptcy have been more difficult, or would it have been the same situation?
I think it would have been, I don't practice bankruptcy law. My knowledge base is limited, I'd say. But I think it's challenging because what happens is if you're a publicly traded company, you do have a duty to your stockholders.
Right.
And when you go and file bankruptcy, what do you think happens to your stock? It goes down the tubes. Your stockholders lose a huge amount of money. Having said that, the flip side of it is if it's go into bankruptcy or go out of business, well, your stockholders are probably much better off in the long run if you don't go out of business. Now when you file bankruptcy and your company gets dissolved, the stockholders lose too. That's the risk in investing, right? But I think I personally believe I'd like to personally think it's more challenging to just go file bankruptcy if you're a publicly traded company than it is if you're privately held like Purdue Pharma is.
Do you think other companies will come out and try to settle now that Purdue's bankruptcy, J&J's been, kind of settled? Any other pharmaceutical companies come out and try to settle and avoid this?
Yeah, I think it provides a pretty significant, both those things provide a pretty significant incentive to try to find a resolution to this.
Yeah.
Because, for example, well, for starters, not all pharmaceutical companies, not everybody's huge, right? Not everybody is the size of Purdue Pharma,
right,
and certainly the size of Johnson & Johnson. So if they can't find a resolution, it could put them out of business, number one. Filing bankruptcy, conceivably could put them out of business. And so I think what both of the things do is they sort of, wake these guys up and make them really start to think about risk management and how do we manage what's going on in a way that allows us to deal with it, but still stay in business and drive forward and be around, 2 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And so, I think when it comes to that, I think both these events will be big catalysts. And I can tell you, I think the judge, from everything I've read, who's handling the big case in Ohio, the federal judge really is pushing everybody to find a resolution. They haven't gotten close to it yet, as far from what I can tell or from what I understand. But there's a reasonably good chance that all of that gets resolved before it ends up in trial next year sometime. And so, and what's interesting to me is, again, really the players in all of this right now aren't individual claimants. It's not somebody like your dad who, who's bringing a claim saying, look, it's the way you marketed this, the way you pursued this as a business, harmed me, and now you need to pay me individually. I mean, these are the states, and the states aren't trying to go, let's say, get a chunk of $50 million and then divide it up amongst claimants. They're taking that money and using it from a public perspective, whether it's treatment centers, whether it's, programs, to deal with, let's say, one example would be, I don't know if this is what they would use it for, but let's say, inmates within the, Department of Corrections within the state who have opioid addiction, and providing services to them, or, it's really, the states will use it at a public level. So I don't think really you've even seen the beginnings of individual claimants bringing their claims and mass tort starting at that level. I think that's coming. I don't know that for sure. We certainly, are talking to people who believe they have claims, and talking to other lawyers who handle mass tort claims and trying to figure out where this is going next, and all those other things. But I think right now we're at the beginning stages of what all this will be. You've seen this in with not lots of other products cases, but some. I mean, one would be, asbestos or mesothelioma.
Right.
Those claims have been going on for a long time, really what's happened is you have claimants who continue to come along. And so, I think there's a long way for all of this to go before it's resolved.
Yeah. And that kind of leads, and I'm going to go back a little bit to how the states are going to be using it towards the public as a question, and correct me if I'm wrong. So the states, are getting this bulk of money and are going to use it for public use, for rehab centers and ways to rehabilitate people that were addicted by this, right? So the state was affected initially when this broke out, right? So they had to pour out their own funds to somehow control this problem, and then now they're kind of taking that back, or they're taking the effort from their perspective of, okay, we're going to avoid this in the future. Were you going to use this money to rehab the people that were affected by it all?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. From my perspective, it seems a little, I don't know, I guess the best word I can come up with is intangible. Meaning, as all this has played out over the last 20 years, because remember, OxyContin came on the market in about 1997. So we're 2019 now. So it's been about 22 years.
22 years.
You sort of extrapolate out, right? You take somebody who, gets addicted to opioids, they're functional, their life's going well. Because they get addicted to opioids, they lose their job, they lose their home, they end up homeless. Now that has an impact on society, right? It has an impact on us publicly. We now have to provide
Right.
services to you because you can't support yourself. You can't take care of yourself. You're homeless. How do we help you, kick the addiction, get back on your feet, become a productive member of society. So that's, from my perspective, it's really sort of this intangible sequence of events that the state's talking about. They're not, as far as, I don't think they're really saying, oh, well, we've paid X amount for rehab over the last 22 years, so you need to pay us back.
Oh, got it.
That's where this whole public nuisance kind of
Right.
angle comes into this. And so, I guess if I had more faith in our bureaucrats or governmental leaders, I'd have more faith that this money would actually be used in a way
Right. Yeah.
that benefited people who have actually been harmed by opiates. I don't necessarily believe that at this point. I mean, every state will use their money differently. Every state will use their money how they think they need to use it. But, and I guess it's possible, when they work out, ultimately when resolutions are worked out, there's some restrictions on how the money's used. But it's not done until it's done. And if you have no restrictions and you just give the money to the state, they'll use it on whatever they think they need to use it on.
Right.
Roads, kindergarten through 12th grade education. I don't know. If your government leaders, they use money where they think they need.
Yeah, where they think it's.
If they've got that ability. And so that's the biggest challenge I see is I don't know that any resolution with the states directly benefits people who have been harmed by opioids in these companies very well.
So that's kind of where my next question comes in. Like, more importantly, this show isn't really helping the state at all in any way. How does this affect people that have been affected by opioids or their family members have? How can you help them? How does this help them?
Well, and I think that's what has to happen is, quite honestly, plaintiffs' lawyers
Right.
have to, start to, communicate to victims out there, potential victims out there, about, bringing claims. Because, quite frankly, for individuals to be, I believe, individually compensated, they're going to have to bring claims on their own. And move through this process. And like I said, I think the process for individuals is really just at the beginning phases. And it's like anything else. I'll take vaccinations. Back years and years ago, decades ago, when people were harmed by vaccinations, at some point the government put a program in place and said, well, you can bring a claim and here's how these claims work. And they put a structure to it and they put a fund together. And that's where victims go. What tends to happen is you have, active claimants, and at some point these cases ultimately end, but you typically end up with a fund somewhere down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. So future claimants, if there are future claimants, have a place to make a claim. It just depends on what the likelihood, I think, of kind of these claims continuing to go on. So you see that a lot with diseases like lung cancer, and those types of things. Something like, opioids, it's a little bit, I'll be curious to see what happens. I don't see the medications going away, but I think what we've already seen happen, and I don't think it's found the right middle ground yet, is you went from far too many doctors prescribing far too many opioids for the things they shouldn't be prescribing.
Right.
And the argument is that's all based off the marketing that the pharmaceutical companies have done. Because I think that people mistakenly think, or maybe the general public mistakenly thinks, when we talk about marketing, we're talking about TV ads. That's not really what this is about. This is about how, for example, Purdue Pharma really marketed to healthcare providers. They really set up a whole system of conferences, and what they did was they put together a very sophisticated data gathering process where they basically could tell you, here's where the most prescriptions for OxyContin are written in the U.S. This city, or this state, this town, this doctor, and they would specifically go and hit those doctors up and push them to incentivize them to even give out more.
Right.
You know, and it had nothing to do with, you know, having, you know, more patients. Is to, you know, push this stuff more. And then in the process, you know, so you have the incentivization of all of this. You have things like, if at least the allegations are, they really fed to their salespeople. Oh, if somebody asks what's the likelihood of addiction, your standard answer is less than 1%, which wasn't anywhere near being accurate. You know, and so it really had to do with their incentivization programs and these conferences and how they dealt with doctors and marketed to doctors, not the general public in, let's say, TV commercial. And I think that's important because that, you know, we get used to seeing TV commercials, right, for medications, at least these days. But the idea is that's a very systematic marketing approach that at least allegedly included a lot of misinformation to doctors and, you know, a lot of calculation on who they were marketing to, why they were marketing to them. And it was all about money. And it ignored the addictive qualities of opioids. And so where you take a drug, quite frankly, that really, and this is my personal belief, is needed, you know, for cancer patients, for, you know, and in particular for cancer patients. And you as a company decide, well, but that market's not big enough.
Right.
And so we want to market to the general public that has either chronic pain or just pain. So you go in because you hurt your ankle and some doctor gives you Oxycontin instead of, you know, like some heavy duty Tylenol. Well, I mean, do you really need Oxycontin for your, you know, severely sprained ankle? No. You know, but they give it to you and then you get addicted. And now you're, you know, there's a whole chain of events that's negative, conceivably. You know, but that's the problem is, you know, the market that it really serves is creates much less profitability for these companies. And so they pushed it out to a grand scale. Well, now that all this is coming out, one of the challenges I think that we face is suddenly everybody tightens up. And now if you're a patient who can really benefit from this medication, maybe you don't get it. Yeah, and I do think that's something we do need to protect. I mean, you know, I don't know that you would go and, let's say, make this medication illegal. So, you know what, we're no longer going to make it available to a chronic or a severely ill patient who has severe pain who could really benefit from it. You know, but again, that's only a fraction of the overall population. And that's really the problem I think all these companies have had with, you know, opioids is they've really focused on the profit and said, screw the patient. And I think now, to a certain degree, you know, and who knows, we'll see when it all shakes out. It may be to a large degree, you know, how do they put it? The chickens are coming home to roost.
Yeah.
And, you know, and it's been 20 years and you've made a huge amount of money, but, you know, now you're going to stop. And that's the big thing. And that's really, I think, what this is all about. And that's where the biggest positive impact comes, is that needs to happen. You know, the medications need to be managed correctly. They need to be prescribed correctly, and they need to, you know, be handled and marketed correctly from at the big pharma level. So all this stuff stops. And then, you know, and along the way, you deal with everybody who's been harmed, because the reality of it is we'll take somebody who becomes addicted and passes away, Let's say you become, I mean, I think there have been lots of people from what I've read, or my understanding is, certainly could be wrong, but, you know, again, you get addicted to opioids. You're on opioids and you go out and you shouldn't mix alcohol and opioids. And you have 3 glasses of wine, or maybe it's a dozen glasses of wine. I don't know, but you mix alcohol with it and then you don't wake up the next morning. Well, if somebody is killed because of their addiction to opioids, it doesn't matter what's paid out tomorrow. It's not going to bring them back. It's not going to make, you know, it's not going to fill the void for their family. It's just the only recourse our system provides. You know, so what really needs to happen out of all of this is how these medications are used and prescribed needs to really go back to, I think, where it originally should have been. before it all became about profit. I mean, that's just my personal belief. But
So if someone were to file a claim, what would their steps be? What did they need to do? And at what point do they decide I should file a claim? Because I know there's obviously advertisements to the public at this point on, where we're pulling these cases in and we're trying to get claimants for it. At what point does someone decide, hey, I think I might have a case, or a family member, and what are their next steps?
yeah, well, I mean, what they need to do is, call us or call an attorney like us that handles, mass tort injury cases. And, really what we do is we would sit down, we would get all the information we need from them about what's happened and how it's happened and, who's been harmed. I mean, again, you have everything from potential wrongful death claims to, somebody who's sitting in front of you saying, I'm currently addicted to opioids, and I can't figure out how to get off of them. And here's the impact it's had on me so far. And, so everybody's claim is individual. And so what happens in these mass tort cases, in the grand scheme of things, is as they develop, really what happens is when you have enough claimants around the country, lawyers have to go and start to file their lawsuits. But then, someone will go and start the process in federal court. And then suddenly what happens is all of these cases become part of that action. Unless, and this does happen, unless the attorney at the local level can figure out a legal reason why an individual's case should be outside of that mass tort. It's not an easy thing to do because, again, from the court's perspective, they want them all in one big giant group because it's easier to handle and to address. And sometimes, a lot of times cases are better off in that group. But there are cases that if you can keep them outside of that group, they're better claims for your clients. You're in a position to get your clients more money. It's just difficult to do. You've got to have, the best way I'll put it, I guess, on your podcast is I, as a lawyer, have to have a hook that gets me out of the mass tort process, out of what they call the the MDL process, the multi-district kind of litigation process. But it all starts with people who have been harmed, sitting down, talking to an attorney, and finding an attorney who will take the case. And then it moves forward by those attorneys prosecuting those cases. And where a lot of it actually starts is those attorneys actually trying those cases or those claims individually in state court. And what happens a lot of times is suddenly, that's what drives the growth. I mean, we've seen it when you look at the Roundup litigation for Roundup weed killer that's going on right now. There have been a number of individual verdicts that have been giant, and they're individual. They're not part of this jurisdictional litigation. I mean, again, to a large degree, that's just a roll-up. And so what happens is at some point, you have enough people participating in this, enough claimants, I would say, that's how the courts decide to deal with it. But it's like anything else within our legal system. The only way you ever make anything happen is you go and hire a lawyer who drives your case forward with you. That's where it all has to start.
Yep.
We're happy to talk to anybody, whether they're in Arizona or anywhere in the country about these cases. But the reality of it is if you live in Florida, there are a lot of good lawyers in Florida too. If you live in Alabama, there are great lawyers in Alabama. And so, but it takes, I think, individual claimants going forward and saying, look, here's how I was harmed, here's what my claim is, and the lawyer taking that case and running with it. And then this litigation just builds from there. And I honestly believe that's where we are with these opioid cases. We're at the beginning of that process.
And is the criteria different for everyone when they're being questioned by the attorney? It's different.
Yeah. I mean, it is. It's just the
it's individualized
cases. Yeah. I mean, if, for example, I were to sit down with somebody, and I'm talking to them about how they're addicted to opioids, and here's the damage caused by the opioids, but then we really start to look into the case and we realize, well, before they were addicted to opioids, they were addicted to heroin. that case is most likely much different than somebody who has a case where it's clearly documented they became addicted to opioids. They had never been addicted to anything before. They, were, for lack of a better way to put it, living a pristine life, went in, had knee surgery, and now they were addicted to opioids. And then here's the damage that caused. I've gotten divorced.
Right.
I never see my kids. I lost my job that paid
Yep.
me, $80,000 a year. So every case is different. And I'd love to sit here and, tell everybody listening to this that the system is actually fair to everybody, and it's not. It's everybody's got a different case. In any of these cases, who you are and how you've ended up, being harmed is a big part of the case. And so now, having said that, at the mass tort level, to a certain degree, I think that becomes less of an issue. But certainly with individual cases, it's a big issue.
So when the attorney goes to the state to fight for the claimant, they're trying to pull money from the money that the state's been given.
Yeah. Well,
So like in Johnson & Johnson or Purdue, they got $10 billion to the state. Johnson & Johnson settled at $572 million as opposed to the $17 billion. You're going to the state for that?
Well, no. I mean, here's one thing that will be interesting to see, because we won't know until it's done. I mean, again, we had talked about the state a little bit, and my lack of confidence is that the state would use any settlement monies to directly benefit victims. That's always a concern of mine. I'm a skeptical guy when it comes to government. Having said that, though, what I'm interested in seeing is this. One part of any settlement monies, or it could include the entire amount, could be a settlement pool for victims who have been harmed.
Right.
I mean, it actually could be. It could be put in that pool, and then you set up a process. The state would set up a process for anybody who believes they have a claim to go make that claim with the state. And then what they tend to do is they tend to set up some sort of structure to what case values are, depending on levels of harm. And so that could happen when it comes to these settlements with the state. Now, what I personally would hate to see happen, it's possible it could play out this way, is we end up in a scenario where all the monies available from the pharmaceutical companies to compensate victims are run through different state funds. But who knows? I mean, again, let's take the BP oil spill cases.
Right.
You essentially had one giant fund set up that was part of that BP oil settlement, and then lawyers all took their claims through that federal process to the federal court and said, here's my claim, here's how my client's been harmed, and everybody sort of lines up, and you make your claim, and there's a process that's set up to evaluate the value of each of those claims, and ultimately they decide, again, through that process, somebody is still deciding, is it a legitimate claim that meets our criteria? If so, that's step one. Then the next step is, what's the value of that claim? And then they pay out on it. And so, that's possible it's possible that this all ends up there, out of this original litigation that's going on in Ohio. I'd hate to see that happen. But, again, what needs to happen with anybody who believes they have a claim, who says, hey, look, I've been harmed by, Oxycontin or oxycodone or any of these opioid medications. You got to go talk to a lawyer, and, find a lawyer who has some insight into this litigation, who's interested in helping you, because that's not every lawyer. I mean, for starters, not all lawyers handle personal injury cases. And I would say, I think the vast majority of lawyers out there who handle personal injury cases don't necessarily take on mass tort cases. But if you don't go talk to somebody, you're never going to get anything or get anywhere when it comes to being compensated for being injured. And so that's where it starts. I mean, again, all this it's just getting rolling. And so I don't know what the ultimate resolution will be, but that's these cases take years.
Yeah.
It's not a quick process. And so, but again, I think there are a lot of people out there who have been harmed directly by opioids.
I agree.
And so, I can't, it's just, that's what everybody needs to do, is start to gather information, find a lawyer they like, find a lawyer that they want to work with, and move forward from there.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much, Doug. That's awesome information. If you've been affected by opioids, obviously first seek help, look rehab, tell a family member. But, secondly, if you feel like you might have a claim, reach out to Doug Zanes or any other mass tort attorney that might be able to help you. Doug, just a couple more fun questions that weren't part of my list. I always end the podcast with something fun. What's your favorite book? Or what are you reading now?
Oh, let's see. I think, my favorite book that I've read in a while, and I'm spacing on the title. Can't remember if it's Shoe Dog, but it's the Phil Knight's Nike book.
Uh-huh. I think I've seen it.
On the beginning of basically how he started Nike shoes. Out of the trunk of his car back when he was a college kid, and the evolution, of building that company. I like reading, business books. I've got, and I actually at this conference I was at over the last couple of days, I've got them on my in my iPhone notes. But there are 3 books on leadership that I need to buy, or I want to buy.
What were they?
I don't know. I've got them.
Okay. Well, there's a good podcast you got to listen to called Business Wars. There's one Nike versus Adidas.
Okay.
And there's a few of them. So if you like podcasts, I do. That's a good podcast, because if you like the Nike story, you'll like to hear how they overcame Adidas and the battle between the 2 companies.
Yeah, because I like reading about the building of companies, because it's so easy to mistakenly think, oh, it must have been easy. You look at what Nike is today, and you read the story.
What it took, yeah.
What it took, and you realize, wow, nothing's ever easy. Nothing worth doing is ever easy. And, there were a number of points within that process where that something happened differently in that company wouldn't exist today. And so, I find them very insightful just from a business perspective and trying to build and, run our law firm.
Yep, I agree. Business is tough. I had a friend reach out the other day through text message. I guess he saw my social media post that I'm traveling. He goes, oh man, looks like business is doing well. I'm like, well, I'm traveling to go gain some business, man. So it never stops. It never stops. Favorite food?
Mexican food. I like it.
You're in Arizona for a reason, right?
Well, I grew up down on the Mexican border here in a little town called Douglas, Arizona. So I grew up living off of tacos and enchiladas and just Mexican food.
And the show's called SEO Happy Hour for a reason. If you do drink, what's your poison? If not, what it?
I'm a red wine guy.
Red wine, cab or what?
Yeah, I like heavy Cabernets.
Nice.
I love Camus cabs.
Camus style, nice.
There are some, there are a lot of red blends that we like, but like Orange Swift has a new red blend called, I think it's 8 Years in the Desert.
Okay.
For if you know wine and know Orange Swift, he created the Prisoner red wine blend, which is a great.
Yeah, I had Prisoner the other night in Vegas. Yeah.
Yeah, which I really like, and I guess when he sold, he had an 8-year non-compete to make red blends, and so the 8 years is up, and now he has a wine called 8 Years in the Desert.
Oh, really?
It's pretty phenomenal. No one can tell me if it's going to be something they continue to make, or if it's sort of just hey, we're back, and it'll be around for a year or so. But it's really worth trying, and it's kind of like the Prisoner. It's not an inexpensive wine, but it's about $45-50 a bottle,
right.
At a wine store or grocery, at a wine store or a grocery store that sells good wines. But it's, it's not $100 or $120 bottle, so it's reasonable.
Yeah, I had a good one. I think it was called Mercury or something like that, by another winemaker that left and had a non-compete and went and started that, and it was really good.
See, what's
Uh,
pretty bad is it's much easier for me to sit here and name off the wines and talk about them than it is books.
yeah,
Not sure what that says about me.
that said a lot. No. Awesome. So we talked favorite room. Cool. So we're all set. Doug, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This is awesome.